Elena Torres never imagined her life would completely change when she found a half-open drawer in her boss's private study that October afternoon. At 48, with hands calloused from years of labor and a heart weary from relentless struggle, she was just a cook, fighting desperately to afford treatment for her ailing mother. But when her eyes landed on those forgotten documents scattered on the desk, when her fingers trembled, realizing the numbers didn't reconcile and the signatures revealed a monstrous betrayal, Eleanor held in her hands the power to save or destroy everything. There, in black and white, was the proof that her boss's partner had been systematically draining the company for years, preparing a final devastating blow that would leave hundreds of families jobless and an honest man utterly ruined. In that silent moment, with the rain drumming against the windows and her heart pounding in her chest, she faced an impossible choice: keep the terrible secret and protect her job, or risk everything to do what was right, knowing it could mean losing the only income keeping her mother alive. What Elena didn't know was that this courageous decision would lead her down a path riddled with shocking betrayals, unexpected twists, and discoveries that would change not only her life, but the fate of everyone around her. The journey that began with tears of despair in a lonely kitchen would end up transforming a simple woman into an unlikely heroine, proving that honesty, even when it costs everything, holds a power that no wealth can buy. This is the true story of how a humble cook saved a businessman from ruin, unmasked a cruel criminal, and discovered an inner strength she never knew she possessed. Stay until the end of this story, because every twist will touch your heart, every tear will make you reflect on the value of integrity, and the stunning outcome will show you that doing the right thing, even in the most difficult moments, always pays off and can change lives in unimaginable ways. The rain beat heavily against the mansion windows when Ethan Hayes, 52, pulled his silver SUV into the Greenwich garage 2 days ahead of schedule. The business trip had wrapped up sooner than planned, and all he wanted was a hot shower and some rest. The lights were on, which was normal for that time of night, but there was something different in the air. Something he couldn't place as he climbed the entry steps, feeling the weight of his suitcase in his right hand and the exhaustion of 3 intense days of meetings trying to salvage crucial contracts. The wealthy suburbs slept quietly under the October storm, and the empty streets seemed more silent than ever. Opening the door, Ethan heard a sound that stopped him dead in the hall. Crying. A muffled, desperate sound coming from the kitchen. His first thought was that something had happened to Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper who had managed the house for 15 years and had been on medical leave for a week with a bad case of the flu. He dropped his suitcase and quickly walked toward the sound, his heart rate spiking. The house, usually so organized and silent, felt invaded by a strange, heavy energy that made every step harder than the last. When he entered the kitchen, the scene was entirely unexpected. Elena Torres, 48, his cook who had only worked there for 8 months, was seated at the table, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs she tried unsuccessfully to stifle. Scattered around her on the light wooden surface were papers, many papers, documents Ethan instantly recognized as belonging to his private study, that small room on the 2nd floor where he kept everything related to Apex Textiles, the company he had run for over 20 years. His blood ran cold. Elena lifted her face at the sound of his steps, and what he saw in her eyes completely unnerved him. It wasn't guilt, nor was it shame for the invasion of privacy. It was sheer terror, genuine desperation from someone who had just stumbled upon something terrible and didn't know what to do with the information. Her hands shook as she clutched a yellowed envelope, and tears continued to stream down her time-worn face, marked by hard work. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Only more tears, Ethan felt rage begin to boil inside him. This woman had touched his personal documents. She had invaded his most private space. He was known in Greenwich for his rigidity, for keeping people at a distance, for never fully trusting anyone since he had been betrayed by a former partner 15 years ago, a blow that had nearly destroyed everything he had built. And now, here was more proof that his distrust had always been justified. People couldn't be trusted. They always disappointed him. Always. He took 3 long strides toward the table, his voice louder than he intended. He demanded to know what she thought she was doing, messing with things that didn't concern her. He asked if she didn't know these were confidential documents, that she had no permission to be there, much less to open drawers and read papers that belonged exclusively to him. His voice echoed off the kitchen walls, and he saw Elena flinch in her chair, but she didn't look away. There was something in those brown eyes that made him hesitate for a second before continuing. Elena finally found her voice, weak and trembling. She said, Mrs. Peterson had asked her to organize the study while she was sick, that she hadn't intended to trespass, only to tidy up as usual. But then, while putting away some papers scattered on the desk, she saw numbers that didn't make sense, values that didn't reconcile, strange transfers, and the more she looked trying to figure out if she was mistaken, the more frightened she became, because she understood numbers. Her late father, who passed 10 years ago, had been a CPA his entire life and taught her everything about spreadsheets, balances, and cash flow. Ethan felt the floor drop out from under him. He pulled up a chair and sat down heavily, taking the documents Elena held with trembling hands. They were company bank statements, financial reports from the last 3 years, and proof of transfers he had never authorized. And they all bore the same electronic signature, Victor Graham. His partner of 15 years, the man he trusted to handle the administrative side while he focused on production and sales. The man who ate lunch at his house every Sunday, who knew every detail of his personal life, who had stood by him when his marriage to Mariana fell apart 7 years ago. The silence that settled in the kitchen was heavy as lead. Outside, the rain continued to fall, beating on the roof with increasing intensity. Ethan scanned the numbers, feeling his breathing constrict. They were staggering amounts. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned from the company accounts over the years, always in small increments that wouldn't draw immediate attention, but which collectively amounted to a fortune. And he, trusting Victor blindly, had never audited closely enough, never questioned. After all, they were partners. They were friends. Or so he thought. Elena wiped the tears with the back of her hand and began to speak again, this time with more firmness in her voice. She said she didn't want to believe what she was seeing, that she tried to find a logical explanation, some accounting error that would justify those figures. But the more she looked, the more evidence she found. There were documents hidden at the back of a locked drawer, which was open because Mrs. Peterson had left the key on the desk with a note asking Eleanor to organize everything. Documents that showed fake contracts, falsified invoices, a complex and well-executed scheme of resource diversion that had been ongoing for at least 3 years. Ethan lifted his eyes from the papers and looked at Elena, truly looked at her for the first time since she started working in his home. He saw a middle-aged woman with dark hair starting to grey at the temples, calloused hands from a lifetime of hard labor, simple but always clean and well-maintained clothes. He saw someone who was genuinely terrified, not because she had been caught doing something wrong, but because she had uncovered something that put her in an impossible position. And he saw honesty, a rare honesty that he had long stopped believing existed. She continued speaking, the words coming quickly now, as if she needed to tell everything before she lost her nerve. She said she thought about simply putting the documents back and pretending she had never seen anything, that she spent hours sitting in that kitchen debating what to do. because she knew telling the truth could cost her job, and she couldn't lose this job. Not now. Not when her mother, Lourdes Torres, 71, needed expensive cardiac treatment and depended completely on her. Not when she had already lost so much in recent years. Ethan listened to every word in silence, processing not only what she said, but how she said it. There was a vulnerability there that touched something in him that had long been dormant. Elena explained that she had worked for 22 years at the Maplewood Diner downtown, until the establishment abruptly closed its doors 8 months ago, leaving all employees without warning. She spent months looking for work, watching her savings disappear, having to ask for help from her younger sister, Teresa, who had her own struggles. When she finally secured the job at Ethan's house, it felt like a miracle, a fresh start, a chance to regain the dignity she felt she had lost. And now, here she was, holding the proof that the man who employed her was being robbed by someone he trusted. The same situation that put her at risk of losing everything again if he decided she had meddled where she shouldn't. But Elena said something that made Ethan stop breathing for a second. She said that even knowing all the risks, even knowing she might end up on the street again, she couldn't live with the heavy conscience of having seen that and done nothing. Because her father always used to say that character was doing the right thing, even when no one was looking, even when it cost you dearly. Ethan felt something strange happen inside him. The initial anger was giving way to an emotion he couldn't fully identify. Respect, perhaps, or admiration, or simply shock at finding someone who still cared about doing the right thing in an era where everyone seemed only interested in themselves. He looked back at the documents, this time with different eyes, with the mind of a businessman who had built a textile empire from scratch, working 16 hours a day for years, sacrificing marriage and personal life for success. He picked up one of the statements and began to examine it more closely. The transfers were small enough to go unnoticed amid the company's daily volume of operations, but frequent enough to accumulate frightening amounts. Victor was clever, very clever. He knew every detail of the company's financial workings, knew exactly where and how to divert resources without raising suspicion, and Ethan, trusting him completely, had delegated the entire administrative side without questioning, without checking, without suspecting. The memory of what happened 15 years ago came back in full force. Another partner, another man he had trusted, another blow that had almost destroyed everything. Ethan had sworn to himself that he would never be fooled again, that he would never trust anyone blindly again. And yet here he was, discovering he had been betrayed again, by the same blindness, by the same foolish need to believe that loyal people existed in the business world. The pain he felt was physical, as if someone had plunged a knife into his chest and twisted it slowly. Elena remained silent, watching the expressions that crossed Ethan's face. She saw the rage, the shock, the pain, the disappointment. She saw a man whose world was being turned upside down, and she knew exactly what that felt like. When the Maplewood Diner closed, she felt the same way. The same feeling that the ground was disappearing beneath her feet, that everything she believed in was a lie, that there was no security anywhere. But she survived. She got back up. She rebuilt herself. And seeing Ethan there, devastated by the papers she had placed in his hands, Elena felt an unexpected connection, a profound understanding of another's pain. The rain began to subside outside, and the silence of the house became even more pronounced. The kitchen clock read almost midnight. Ethan finally lifted his eyes from the documents and looked directly at Eleanor. He asked, in a voice surprisingly calm, considering the storm, certainly raging inside him, if she was absolutely sure of what she was saying, if she had checked everything carefully, if it couldn't be some mistake, some confusion with account numbering or dates. Elena picked up another envelope that was on the table and handed it to him. Inside was a detailed spreadsheet she had compiled herself during the hours she spent alone in the kitchen, trying to grasp the magnitude of her discovery. She had cross-referenced every suspicious transfer with corresponding dates, cross-checked information from different documents, and verified electronic signatures. The work was meticulous, organized, and professional, exactly the kind of analysis an experienced CPA would perform. And there, in black and white, was irrefutable proof that Victor Graham had been systematically stealing from the company. Ethan held the ledger with hands that trembled slightly. It wasn't just rage he felt now. It was a complex mix of emotions that included fear. Fear of what this meant for Apex Textiles, for the hundreds of employees who depended on it, for his own future. The amounts diverted were so significant that, combined with the normal difficulties of the textile market in recent years, they could be putting the entire operation at risk. He needed to act. He needed to understand the true extent of the problem. He needed help, and it was at that moment that something extraordinary happened. Ethan Hayes, the man who 15 years ago swore never to trust anyone again, the businessman known for his coldness and emotional distance, looked at his cook and asked for help. The words came out with difficulty, as if each syllable cost him a piece of his pride. He said he needed her skill with numbers, that he needed someone he could trust to help him uncover the full scope of the fraud. That he couldn't do this alone, not when Victor had access to everything and could destroy evidence if he realized he was under suspicion. Elena felt tears well up in her eyes again, but this time they were different. They were not tears of despair or fear. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. She said yes, she would help in every way necessary, that she would do whatever it took to ensure justice was served. And in that moment, in that quiet kitchen of a Greenwich mansion under the warm glow of the antique chandelier, an unlikely alliance was born. A partnership between a wounded CEO and an honest cook. A union that would be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. Ethan began organizing the documents, separating them by category and date. He told Elena they would need absolute secrecy, that Victor could not know they were investigating, that they would have to continue acting normally while gathering sufficient evidence to confront him. The task seemed monumental, almost impossible. How do you maintain normalcy when your world is crumbling? How do you look a traitor in the eye every day and pretend nothing is wrong? How do you trust yourself again after being fooled twice? Elena agreed with every word, but her heart was heavy for a reason she hadn't yet revealed. Something she had discovered that afternoon that made the whole situation even more complicated, even more painful. Something that involved her own family in a way she never thought possible. But at that moment, with Ethan looking at her with a mixture of hope and desperation, she couldn't find the courage to tell him, not yet, not when he was already carrying so much weight on his shoulders. The night wore on, and they remained seated at the kitchen table, examining document after document, building an increasingly clear and frightening picture of Victor's betrayal. With every new paper analyzed, every new transfer discovered, the magnitude of the problem became more evident. It wasn't just thousands of dollars, it was hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, when everything was tallied. Enough money to break the company, to destroy everything Ethan had built over decades of hard work. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, Eleanor finally stood up saying she needed to go home. Her mother, Lourdes, would be worried, and she didn't want to raise suspicion by suddenly changing her routine. Ethan agreed, but before she left, he gently held her arm and said something that made her pause. He said he was grateful, that he recognized the courage she had shown in bringing this to him, knowing the risks she ran, that he wouldn't forget what she was doing. Elena merely nodded, unable to speak because of the lump in her throat. She left through the back door, as she always did, and walked through the deserted streets toward her small house. The rain had completely stopped, leaving the air cool and crisp, and the sky began to lighten on the horizon. But inside her, the storm was just beginning, because tomorrow she would have to do something even harder. She would have to confront her niece, Jessica, about the role she, perhaps unknowingly, was playing in Victor's scheme. Ethan was left alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the documents that changed everything. He picked up the phone, thinking about calling someone. His ex-wife. Marianne, maybe, or his lawyer. But then he remembered it was the middle of the night, and he needed to maintain absolute secrecy until he fully understood the situation. He gathered all the papers into a folder and went up to the study, locking everything in a safe only he knew the combination to. Then he sat in his leather chair and looked out the window at the sleeping town. He thought about Victor, about all the years of friendship, all the shared meals, the confidences exchanged, the plans made together. How was it possible that it was all a lie? How could someone look a friend in the eye day after day while systematically robbing him? The pain of betrayal was worse than any financial loss. It was a wound on his soul that he didn't know if he could heal. And then, in the silence of that early morning, Ethan Hayes wept. He wept for the lost friendship, for the betrayed trust, for the uncertain future. He wept for all the times he tried to believe in someone and was disappointed. He cried until he had no more tears, until he felt empty and exhausted. And when he finally stopped, he made a promise to himself. This time, it would be different. This time, he wouldn't let the traitor win. This time he would fight with all his strength, using every weapon available. And the first of those weapons would be Elena Torres, the honest cook who risked everything to do what was right. The dawn arrived, bringing a clear and sunny day, as if the storm of the night before had never happened. But for Ethan, everything had changed. And as he prepared to face another day pretending normalcy, he knew he was about to enter the hardest battle of his life. A battle that would test not only his ability to recover what was stolen, but his ability to trust again, to believe that not all people were traitors, that honesty still existed in the world. The sun was already high when Elena arrived back at Ethan's house the following morning. Her eyes were swollen from crying during the night, and she had barely managed 3 hours of sleep before her alarm clock rang. Lourdes immediately sensed something was wrong, but Elena invented an excuse about watching a sad movie on TV. Lying to her mother hurt almost as much as the weight of the secret she carried about Jessica. Ethan was already in the kitchen when she entered, drinking black coffee and staring out the window with a distant expression. He turned when he heard her, and their eyes met for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. They didn't need to say anything. The silent agreement made the night before was still there, firm between them. Eleanor tied her apron, washed her hands and started preparing breakfast as she did every day. But nothing felt normal. Every gesture, every movement carried the weight of everything they knew and couldn't reveal. The routine followed its usual course. Mrs. Peterson was still recovering at home, so Eleanor had also taken on some cleaning tasks in addition to cooking. This meant she had access to more areas of the house, including the study where everything had begun. Ethan said, in a low voice as she served toast, that they needed to be extremely careful. That Victor called him multiple times a day, and they had an important meeting scheduled at the factory that afternoon. A meeting where, ironically, they would discuss the quarterly numbers. Eleanor felt her stomach turn. She asked if he would be able to maintain his composure, to pretend nothing was wrong. Ethan gave a bitter smile and said he had spent his entire life building a mask of professional coldness. That this would just be another performance, though probably the most difficult one of all. He finished his coffee, put on the grey blazer he always wore for meetings, and left, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the heavy silence of the empty house. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, Eleanor grabbed the phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. Jessica answered on the third ring, her voice bright and carefree, like someone who had no idea of the storm about to break over her life. Eleanor asked her niece to come over for lunch, saying they needed to talk about something important. Jessica found her aunt's serious tone strange, but agreed to show up during her lunch break. The hours until noon passed with agonizing slowness. Elena tried to keep busy preparing the meal, but her hands trembled as she chopped vegetables and seasoned the meat. How was she going to start that conversation? How would she tell her niece that she was being used by a ruthless man? How would she explain that the job Jessica was so thrilled to get was, in fact, part of a criminal scheme? And worse, how could she do this without revealing she was helping Ethan investigate everything? Jessica arrived promptly at noon, wearing a navy blue business suit that Eleanor knew had cost almost the girl's entire first paycheck. She was radiant, her hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and light makeup highlighting her brown eyes. At 23, Jessica was the family's hope, the first to land an office job, the first with a real chance to climb the ladder. And Elena was about to shatter all of it. They sat at the kitchen table, and Elena served the simple, hearty lunch she had prepared. Jessica began eating with an appetite, talking animatedly about a project she was developing at work, and how Mr. Graham was attentive and always praised her dedication. Every word was a stab in Elena's heart, who could barely swallow her own food. Finally, when Jessica paused to drink water, Elena gathered her courage and asked exactly what kind of work her niece was doing. Jessica explained enthusiastically that she was responsible for processing bank transfers, issuing invoices, and organizing financial documentation. Important tasks, she said proudly, that showed the trust Mr. Graham placed in her. Elena felt her blood run cold. These were exactly the functions that would allow Victor to use Jessica as a scapegoat in his fraudulent operations. Elena took a deep breath and began asking more specific questions. She asked if Jessica verified the documents she signed electronically, if she checked the amounts of the transfers, if she questioned anything that seemed strange. Her niece laughed, saying she trusted Mr. Graham completely, that he always explained everything perfectly, and that she was learning so much. And then, without realizing the gravity of what she was saying, Jessica mentioned that sometimes she signed blank documents that Victor filled out later because he said it was more efficient that way. Elena's world collapsed at that moment. Jessica was completely innocent, but she was being manipulated so obviously that it was painful. Elena took her niece's hands across the table and with a trembling voice began to explain that she needed Jessica to be extremely careful. That in the business world, people weren't always what they seemed. That signing blank documents was extremely dangerous. It could legally compromise her in ways she couldn't even imagine. Jessica pulled her hands away abruptly, her face turning red. She said her aunt was being paranoid, that she was jealous of her success, that Mr. Graham was a respected man in Greenwich, a partner in a major company, a personal friend of her aunt's boss. How could Elena insinuate something so horrible? The words came out harsh, filled with hurt and anger. Jessica stood up from the table, grabbed her purse and said she was disappointed, that she expected more support from her family instead of attempts to sabotage her career. Elena tried to hold her niece, tried to explain better, but Jessica was already walking out the door. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. Elena collapsed into the chair, burying her face in her hands. She had failed, not only failed to warn Jessica of the danger, but also created a rift in her relationship with her niece. And the worst part was knowing she couldn't tell the whole truth, couldn't show the evidence proving Victor was a criminal, because that would jeopardize Ethan's investigation. The phone rang, pulling her from her dark thoughts. It was Teresa, her sister and Jessica's mother. Her voice was laced with fury. Jessica had called her crying, saying that Aunt Elena was trying to destroy her career, that she was inventing absurd stories about her boss. Teresa accused Elena of jealousy, of not being able to stand seeing her own niece succeed while she herself was stuck in a cook's job. The words were cruel, calculated to wound, and they achieved their goal, perfectly. Elena tried to defend herself, tried to explain that she was only worried about Jessica's safety, but Teresa wouldn't listen. She said Elena had always been problematic, always stirring up trouble where none existed, that she should worry more about her own life and stop poking her nose into other people's business. The call ended with a sharp click, and Elena was left holding the dead phone, feeling utterly alone and misunderstood. The tears came then, hot and abundant. She cried for the fight with Jessica, for her sister's unjust accusation, for the impossibility of telling the whole truth. She cried for the burden she carried alone, for the impossible choices she had to make. Doing the right thing had never felt so painful. Her father always said that honesty was the hardest path, but the only one that allowed you to sleep peacefully. But at that moment, Eleanor questioned if that was true, because she wasn't sleeping peacefully. And now, on top of everything, she had lost the affection of the people she loved most. When she managed to pull herself together, it was past 3 in the afternoon. Eleanor washed her face with cold water, dried her swollen eyes, and went back to work. She had to prepare Ethan's dinner. She had to maintain normalcy. Life continued, even when it felt impossible. She started preparing a vegetable soup, the mechanical movement of her hands helping to calm the storm inside her. It was then she heard Ethan's car pulling up, much earlier than normal. He walked through the kitchen door with an expression Eleanor had never seen before. It was pure, undisguised fear. He dropped his leather briefcase onto the table with a dull thud and sat down heavily, loosening his tie as if it was suffocating him. Elena dried her hands on her apron and approached, asking what had happened. Ethan ran his hands over his face and said something that made her blood run cold. Victor had pressed him during the meeting to sign a series of documents that, according to Victor, were necessary for an urgent corporate restructuring. Ethan, trying to buy time and maintain the facade of normalcy, said he needed to review them carefully before signing anything. Victor insisted, claiming it was urgent, that there were deadlines to meet. And then, when Ethan continued to resist, Victor dropped a bomb. He said that if Ethan no longer trusted him, maybe it was time to dissolve the partnership, that he had offers from other investors interested in buying Ethan's share of the company. Elena felt her legs give way. She asked if Victor had mentioned who those investors were. Ethan nodded and named Anil, the Sterling Group, a major investment firm, the same group Eleanor had seen mentioned in the documents the night before. The same group Victor intended to sell Ethan's share to using falsified paperwork. The situation was worse than they imagined. Victor wasn't just stealing little by little. He was preparing to deliver the final blow, to seize total control of the company. Ethan recounted how he tried to remain calm, telling Victor he needed a few days to think everything over, but he could see in his partner's eyes that time was running out. Victor was rushing things, and that could only mean one thing. He knew, or at least suspected, that something was wrong. Maybe he had noticed some documents were out of place in the study. Maybe he had sensed a change in Ethan's demeanor, or perhaps he was simply following his original plan, and the timing was a coincidence. Elena pulled up a chair and sat next to Ethan. She told him about the disastrous conversation with Jessica, about how her niece was being unknowingly used, about how she tried to warn her and ended up creating a seemingly irreparable family conflict. Ethan listened in silence, and when she finished, he said something surprising. He said he understood her pain perfectly because he was going through something similar himself. The loneliness of knowing a terrible truth and not being able to fully share it. The burden of protecting people who didn't even know they were in danger. They sat there for a long time, two human beings carrying burdens too heavy for one person alone. And it was in this moment of shared vulnerability that something shifted between them. It was no longer just boss and employee. It wasn't just an alliance of convenience. It was a genuine connection between two people who had met at rock bottom and decided to help each other climb out. Ethan finally broke the silence. He said they needed to act faster than planned, that they couldn't wait months to gather all the evidence. Victor was forcing a decision, and they needed to be prepared to counterattack. He grabbed a notepad and began making a list. They needed a trustworthy attorney. They needed an independent auditor to examine the company books. They needed copies of all relevant documents stored in a secure location, and they needed to do all this without Victor realizing. Elena looked at the list and felt a wave of determination replace her despair. She said she knew someone who could help. Her father had a friend, Mr. Arthur Kennedy, an attorney specializing in business law. He had retired a few years ago but still maintained his license and was known for his discretion and integrity. If anyone could help them navigate this complex legal situation, it was him. Ethan immediately picked up the phone and asked Elena to call. She dialed the number her mother kept in an old address book, and Mr. Kennedy answered with the deep, calm voice she remembered from childhood. When she explained who she was and mentioned her late father's name, the lawyer's voice warmed. He asked how he could help, and Elena, looking at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly, said they needed to discuss a delicate and urgent matter. Mr. Kennedy said he could receive them at his home office that very night. The meeting was set for 8 o'clock. Ethan and Eleanor spent the rest of the afternoon organizing all the documents they had discovered, making copies of everything and creating a detailed timeline of the fraud. They worked side by side, Eleanor with her natural skill with numbers, and Ethan with his deep knowledge of the company's operations. It was an odd, unlikely, but surprisingly effective partnership. When they finally left to meet Mr. Kennedy, the sky was darkening, and the streets of Greenwich were filling with the late-day traffic. People returning from work, children playing on the sidewalks, the smell of dinner wafting from the houses. Normal life happening while Ethan's world crumbled. He drove in silence, Eleanor beside him holding the briefcase containing the documents. She had never ridden in his car before, never been in a position of such equality. It was strange and comfortable at the same time. Mr. Kennedy's house was in a quiet neighborhood, an old but well-maintained structure with a garden full of rose bushes. He greeted them at the door, a man with white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through people. He was 72, but his posture was straight and his mind visibly sharp. He greeted Elena with an affectionate hug, saying she had grown so much since he last saw her, as a child alongside her father. They sat down in an office lined with legal books, and over the next 3 hours they recounted the entire story. They showed every document, every piece of evidence, every detail of Victor's elaborate fraud. Mr. Kennedy listened in silence, taking occasional notes, his expression growing steadily more serious. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair and remained silent for a long minute that felt like an eternity. Finally, he spoke. He said the situation was serious, much more serious than they likely imagined. Victor's frauds were not just unethical, they were criminal. But the problem was that he had been extremely careful. Almost all the operations bore Jessica's electronic signature, which placed her in a dangerous legal position, even though she was innocent. If this went to court, she could be indicted as an accomplice. The news hit Elena like a bucket of ice water. Mr. Kennedy continued. He said they would need a very careful strategy. First, they would have to gather irrefutable evidence, not just of the fraud, but also that Jessica was being manipulated. They would have to demonstrate that she had no criminal knowledge or intent. This meant obtaining documents showing Victor's instructions, emails, and recordings if possible. Second, they would have to protect the company's assets before confronting Victor, because as soon as he knew he was exposed, he would try to transfer everything he could to offshore accounts or destroy evidence. Ethan asked how much time they had. Mr. Kennedy pondered for a moment and said that based on Victor's pressure for signatures that afternoon, probably no more than 2 weeks, maybe less. They needed to act fast, but with surgical precision. One mistake could cost everything, including the freedom of innocent people like Jessica. When they left Mr. Kennedy's house, it was past 11 at night. They carried with them a detailed action plan and an even greater sense of the gravity of the situation. In the car, on the drive back, Elena finally let the tears flow freely. She cried for her niece, who could end up imprisoned for something she didn't do. She cried for the impossibility of protecting her without revealing everything. She cried for the crushing weight of having to choose between saving Jessica and saving Ethan and the company. Ethan stopped the car at a deserted gas station and, for the first time since they met, touched Elena's hand. He said he wouldn't let Jessica pay for something she didn't do, that they would find a way to protect her and still achieve justice, that she was not alone in this. The words were simple, but the meaning was profound. They were a promise, a vow that they would fight together, no matter the cost. Elena looked at this man who, until just a few days ago, was merely her distant boss, and saw someone completely different. She saw someone who was learning to trust again, to open up, to care about the suffering of others. And she wondered if, in the midst of all that chaos and pain, something good might be emerging. A true friendship, forged in the fire of adversity. A connection that transcended the barriers of class and social position that normally separated them. But there was no time for philosophizing. The war against Victor was just beginning, and the clock was ticking against them. The following days were a torturous blend of seemingly normal routine and invisible tension that threatened to suffocate Elena every minute. She arrived at Ethan's house every morning at 7 sharp, prepared coffee, cleaned, cooked, keeping everything running as it always had. But in her free time, when she was sure she was alone, she searched every corner of the study for more evidence, taking photos of documents with the old cell phone she barely knew how to use, jotting down numbers and dates in a small notebook she hid deep in her purse. Ethan, for his part, went to the factory every day and pretended everything was fine. He greeted Victor with a firm handshake, discussed production figures, approved budgets, and attended meetings. But every interaction was silent torture. Every fake smile from Victor, every friendly word, every gesture of camaraderie was like salt in an open wound. And the worst was that Victor seemed completely comfortable, with no trace of guilt or remorse, as if robbing a friend were the most natural thing in the world. On Thursday of that week, a full week after the initial discovery, Elena received a call that made her stop in the middle of the kitchen with her heart pounding. It was Jessica. Her niece hadn't spoken to her since the fight, and the silence had been eating away at Elena. She answered with trembling hands, expecting more accusations, more anger. But the voice she heard on the other end was different. It was small, scared, confused. Jessica said she needed to talk to her aunt, that something strange was happening at work, and she didn't know who else to talk to. Victor had asked her to sign a series of documents that morning, documents much more complex than the usual ones. When she tried to read before signing, he became impatient, saying she was taking too long, that she needed to trust him. And then he did something he had never done before. He grabbed her computer mouse and quickly scrolled through the pages, pointing where she should sign without giving her time to read the content. Elena felt her blood run cold. She asked if Jessica had signed. Her niece said yes, but afterward she had a bad feeling. That something about Victor's attitude was different, more nervous, more aggressive. And then she did something that surprised even herself. Before leaving for lunch, she went back to the computer and took screenshots of all the documents she had signed that morning. She didn't know exactly why, she just felt like she should. And now, looking at the printed pages in her hands, she couldn't understand half of what was written there. Elena closed her eyes, sending a silent prayer of gratitude. She asked Jessica to come to Ethan's house immediately to bring the documents, that this was more urgent than she imagined. Jessica hesitated, asking if her aunt was still angry with her. Elena felt tears fill her eyes. She said she had never been angry, only worried, that she loved her niece more than anything, and that please trust her this time. Jessica arrived half an hour later, wearing the same blue business suit that was starting to show signs of wear at the seams. She handed the documents to Elena with hands that visibly trembled. Elena began to read, and with every line, her horror grew. These were massive transfers of company assets, not thousands of dollars, millions. Victor was preparing the final blow, transferring everything of value to accounts Elena knew were phantom accounts, shell companies that existed only on paper. She grabbed the phone and called Ethan at the factory. She said only 2 words, "It's urgent." He understood immediately and said he would be home in 20 minutes. While they waited, Elena sat with Jessica at the kitchen table and for the first time told her everything. Every detail of the initial discovery, every piece of fraud evidence, every moment of terror and uncertainty. She watched the color drain from her niece's face, saw her eyes fill with tears, saw comprehension and horror take over her features. Jessica began to cry, sobbing that it was all her fault, that she had been stupid, naive, that she should have realized. Elena held her niece's hands tightly and said no, she was just an honest young woman who trusted the wrong person. That Victor was an experienced manipulator who fooled even Ethan, a businessman with decades of experience. That the fault lay exclusively with him and no one else. When Ethan arrived, he found the 2 women embracing, crying together. He took the documents Jessica had brought, and his face went pale. They were even worse than Elena had described. Those transfers wouldn't just break the company, they would leave it completely empty, a worthless shell, and all of them bore Jessica's electronic signature, placing her in the position of the prime suspect if anyone decided to investigate. Ethan sat down heavily and looked at Jessica. He said she was not guilty of anything, but the situation was extremely serious. That Victor was using her as a shield, making her sign documents that would incriminate her while he walked free. Jessica asked, in a small voice, if she was going to jail. Ethan exchanged a look with Eleanor and said they would do everything in their power to ensure that didn't happen. But for that, they needed her help. Jessica wiped her tears and asked what she needed to do. Ethan explained that she would have to continue working normally, without letting Victor realize she knew anything. That she would have to copy every email, every instruction, every conversation, that proved she was merely following orders without understanding the criminal context. That she would have to be a convincing actress, even while terrified inside. It was a lot to ask of a 23-year-old, but there was no choice. Jessica nodded, wiping her face with her hands. She said she would do whatever was necessary to fix the mess she had unintentionally gotten into. Elena felt pride and terror in equal measure. Pride for her niece's courage, terror for the risks she would have to take. But there was no time for sentimentality. Ethan was already on the phone with Mr. Kennedy, scheduling an emergency meeting for that very night. The afternoon dragged on with agonizing slowness. Jessica returned to work, every step toward Victor's office a small death. Ethan tried to work from home, but spent more time staring out the window than doing anything productive. Elena cooked non-stop. Her way of dealing with anxiety was to keep her hands busy. She made soup, baked bread, made pastries no one would eat. The kitchen smelled wonderful, but the house was filled with a tension so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. At 7 that evening, the 3 were again at Mr. Kennedy's home office. This time, the lawyer was not alone. He had brought a younger colleague, Mr. Dennis Miller, a specialist in financial crimes who was still actively practicing. The 2 men listened to everything, examined the new documents Jessica had brought, and the expressions of both grew increasingly grim. Mr. Miller was direct. He said Victor was accelerating his plan, likely because he had sensed something was wrong, or simply because the time he had long planned for had arrived. The transfers Jessica had signed that morning would be executed in 72 hours, 3 days. After that, the money would disappear into a maze of untraceable offshore accounts, and the company would be bankrupt, unable to pay employees, suppliers, or debts. It would be the end of everything Ethan had built. Ethan asked if there was any way to block the transfers. Mr. Miller said yes, but for that, they would need a court order. And to get a court order, they would need to present solid evidence of fraud to a judge. The problem was that doing so would immediately alert Victor, giving him time to destroy evidence and potentially flee. They were in a race against the clock, where a single wrong move could destroy everything. Mr. Kennedy thought for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the antique wooden desk. Then he had an idea. He said he knew Judge Robert Hayes, a respected magistrate who had retired 2 years ago but still held immense prestige in the local courthouse. If they could convince him of the gravity of the situation, he might use his influence to expedite a protective order without public fanfare. It would be risky, even irregular, but given the exceptional circumstances, it might be the only chance. It was then decided that Ethan and the 2 attorneys would go to the retired judge's house the next morning. They would bring all the evidence, all the documentation, and implore him for help. Meanwhile, Jessica would continue her espionage work, copying everything she could without raising suspicion. And Elena would keep the house running normally, her ears open for any information Ethan might let slip during phone conversations with Victor. When they returned home that night, the weight on the 3 of them was almost unbearable. Jessica was dropped off at her small apartment near downtown, and Eleanor watched the young woman walk into the building with slow steps. Her shoulders slumped, as if carrying the weight of the world. Ethan and Elena continued in silence to his house. When he stopped the car in the garage, neither of them moved for several minutes. Finally, Ethan spoke. He said he was scared, that he couldn't remember the last time he admitted being afraid of anything, but now he felt genuine terror about what might happen. Fear of losing everything, fear of failing to protect Jessica, fear of disappointing Eleanor, who had trusted him to do the right thing. The words came out raspy, laden with an emotion he clearly wasn't used to expressing. Elena turned to look at him. She said she was scared too, that she had been terrified since the moment she saw those first documents. But she had something stronger than fear. She had the certainty that they were doing the right thing, and sometimes doing the right thing meant being afraid and moving forward anyway. The words weren't original, but they were true, and in that moment, they were exactly what both of them needed to hear. They entered the house together, and Ethan went straight to the study, while Eleanor prepared tea. She went up with 2 steaming cups and found him looking at a framed photograph on the desk. It was of him and Victor, taken at the factory's grand opening 15 years ago, both smiling, arms around each other's shoulders, looking toward the future with hope and confidence. Ethan touched the glass of the frame with trembling fingers and said he didn't understand. How could someone smile like that? Make plans like that, build a friendship like that, all while plotting such an absolute betrayal? Elena had no answer for that. Some questions simply don't have satisfying answers. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and they stood there, 2 human beings trying to find meaning in a situation that made no sense at all. After a while, Ethan put the photo away in a drawer. He said he couldn't look at it anymore, that it hurt too much. The night passed slowly. Neither of them got much sleep. Ethan stayed in the study, reviewing documents until almost dawn. Elena went home, but spent the entire night awake, checking her phone every 5 minutes to see if Jessica had sent a message, if everything was all right. Her niece's silence was deafening. When the sun finally rose on Friday morning, bringing a clear and cold day, Ethan was already ready, wearing his best grey suit. The attorneys were set to pick him up at 9. The meeting with Judge Robert was scheduled for 10. Elena arrived earlier than usual and prepared a full breakfast, knowing he would need energy for the day ahead. But Ethan barely touched the food, his stomach knotted with nerves. At 8:50, Ethan's phone rang. It was Jessica, and her voice was strange, too controlled. She said she needed to speak with him urgently, that she had discovered something that changed everything, but she couldn't talk over the phone. It had to be in person. Ethan looked at the clock, at Elena, and made a decision. He told Jessica to come immediately, that the attorneys would wait. Jessica arrived 15 minutes later, running from the street to the door. Her face was flushed, and she was out of breath. She handed Ethan a thin envelope, and inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a printed email, an email from Victor to the Sterling Group, dated 2 months ago. In it, Victor detailed his plan to seize total control of the company, but that wasn't all. He also mentioned that he had compromising information about Ethan, things from the past that he could use as blackmail if necessary. Ethan read the email 3 times, feeling his blood run a little colder with each reading. He asked Jessica where she had found it. She explained that Victor had asked her to organize some old email archives that morning, transferring them to a new server. She was doing it mechanically when she saw Ethan's name appear in one of the subjects. Curious and already suspicious of everything after the previous night, she opened and read it. And then, knowing Victor could delete everything at any moment, she printed it and rushed over. Elena took the paper from Ethan's trembling hands and read it. She felt a rage burn within her like she had never felt before. Victor was not just a thief. He was a calculated predator who had planned every detail of the destruction of a man he called a friend. And he still had ammunition hidden away, secrets he could use to torture Ethan even further. It was a cruelty that surpassed anything she had imagined possible. Ethan was pale as a ghost. Elena asked gently what this compromising information Victor mentioned was. Ethan closed his eyes and after a long moment began to recount something he had never told anyone. 15 years ago, when he was betrayed by the first partner, he had been so desperate to save the company that he considered doing something terrible. Falsifying documents to secure a bank loan. He even prepared everything, but at the last moment he backed out, securing the money legitimately through immense sacrifice. But Victor knew about that near transgression. Ethan had confided in him during a moment of weakness, thinking he was confessing to a friend who would understand. And now that secret, that momentary weakness from 15 years ago, could be used to completely destroy him. Even if he never committed the fraud, just the plan could irreparably tarnish his reputation. The silence that followed was heavy. Elena finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She said that didn't change anything, that everyone made mistakes, everyone had moments of weakness. What mattered was that Ethan hadn't gone through with it, that he chose the difficult but honest path, and Victor using this against him only proved further what kind of person he truly was. The attorneys arrived at that moment, and the entire story had to be retold. Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Miller listened with increasingly serious expressions. When Ethan finished, Mr. Miller said something no one expected. He said that email, however painful it was for Ethan, was actually a gift, because it showed clear premeditation, malicious intent, and a pattern of criminal behavior that went far beyond simple resource diversion. Jessica was dropped off at her small apartment near downtown, and Eleanor watched the young woman walk into the building with slow steps, her shoulders hunched as if carrying the world on her back. Ethan and Elena continued in silence to his house. When he stopped the car in the garage, neither of them moved for several minutes. Finally, Ethan spoke. He said he was scared, that he couldn't remember the last time he admitted being afraid of anything, but now he felt genuine terror about what might happen. Fear of losing everything, fear of failing to protect Jessica, fear of disappointing Elena, who had trusted him to do the right thing. The words came out husky, laden with an emotion he clearly wasn't used to expressing. Elena turned to look at him. She said she was scared too, that she had been terrified since the moment she saw those first documents, But she had something stronger than fear. She had the certainty that they were doing the right thing, and sometimes doing the right thing meant being afraid and moving forward anyway. The words weren't original, but they were true, and in that moment they were exactly what both of them needed to hear. They entered the house together, and Ethan went straight to the study while Eleanor prepared tea. She went up with 2 steaming cups and found him looking at a framed photograph on the desk. It was of him and Victor, taken at the factory's grand opening 15 years ago, both smiling, arms around each other's shoulders, looking toward the future with hope and confidence. Ethan touched the glass of the frame with trembling fingers and said he didn't understand. How could someone smile like that, make plans like that, build a friendship like that, all while plotting such an absolute betrayal? Elena had no answer for that. Some questions simply don't have satisfying answers. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and they stood there, 2 human beings trying to find meaning in a situation that made no sense at all. After a while, Ethan put the photo away in a drawer. He said he couldn't look at it anymore, that it hurt too much. The night passed slowly. Neither of them got much sleep. Ethan stayed in the study reviewing documents until almost dawn. Elena went home, but spent the entire night awake, checking her phone every 5 minutes to see if Jessica had sent a message, if everything was all right. Her niece's silence was deafening. When the sun finally rose on Friday morning, bringing a clear and cold day, Ethan was already ready, wearing his best grey suit. The attorneys were set to pick him up at 9. The meeting with Judge Robert was scheduled for 10. Elena arrived earlier than usual and prepared a full breakfast, knowing he would need energy for the day ahead. But Ethan barely touched the food, his stomach knotted with nerves. At 8:50, Ethan's phone rang. It was Jessica, and her voice was strange, too controlled. She said she needed to speak with him urgently, that she had discovered something that changed everything. But she couldn't talk over the phone. It had to be in person. Ethan looked at the clock, at Elena, and made a decision. He told Jessica to come immediately, that the attorneys would wait. Jessica arrived 15 minutes later, running from the street to the door. Her face was flushed, and she was out of breath. She handed Ethan a thin envelope, and inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a printed email. An email from Victor to the Sterling Group dated 2 months ago. In it, Victor detailed his plan to seize total control of the company, but that wasn't all. He also mentioned that he had compromising information about Ethan, things from the past that he could use as blackmail if necessary. Ethan read the email 3 times, feeling his blood run a little colder with each reading. He asked Jessica where she had found it. She explained that Victor had asked her to organize some old email archives that morning, transferring them to a new server. She was doing it mechanically when she saw Ethan's name appear in one of the subjects. Curious and already suspicious of everything after the previous night, she opened and read it. And then, knowing Victor could delete everything at any moment, she printed it and rushed over. Elena took the paper from Ethan's trembling hands and read it. She felt a rage burn within her like she had never felt before. Victor was not just a thief. He was a calculated predator who had planned every detail of the destruction of a man he called a friend, and he still had ammunition hidden away, secrets he could use to torture Ethan even further. It was a cruelty that surpassed anything she had imagined possible. Ethan was pale as a ghost. Elena asked gently what this compromising information Victor mentioned was. Ethan closed his eyes, and after a long moment, began to recount something he had never told anyone. 15 years ago, when he was betrayed by the first partner, he had been so desperate to save the company that he considered doing something terrible, falsifying documents to secure a bank loan. He even prepared everything, but at the last moment, he backed out, securing the money legitimately through immense sacrifice. But Victor knew about that near transgression. Ethan had confided in him during a moment of weakness, thinking he was confessing to a friend who would understand. And now that secret, that momentary weakness from 15 years ago, could be used to completely destroy him. Even if he never committed the fraud, just the plan could irreparably tarnish his reputation. The silence that followed was heavy. Elena finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She said that didn't change anything, that everyone made mistakes, everyone had moments of weakness. What mattered was that Ethan hadn't gone through with it, that he chose the difficult but honest path, and Victor using this against him only proved further what kind of person he truly was. The attorneys arrived at that moment, and the entire story had to be retold. Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Miller listened with increasingly serious expressions. When Ethan finished, Mr. Miller said something no one expected. He said that email, however painful it was for Ethan, was actually a gift, because it showed clear premeditation, malicious intent, and a pattern of criminal behavior that went far beyond simple resource diversion. He would have signed those papers Victor wanted. He would have handed over his company, his life, his future, everything into the hands of a criminal. Eleanor shook her head. She said she only did what any decent person would do. But Ethan disagreed. He said she risked her job, her security, her relationship with her family, everything to do what was right, that this wasn't common, wasn't normal. It was exceptional. It was heroic. The words made Elena blush, unaccustomed to compliments, especially of that magnitude. She changed the subject, asking what would happen now with the company, with the employees, with everything. Ethan sighed deeply. He said the next few months would be tough. He would have to rebuild the company's financial structure from scratch. He would have to regain the trust of investors, suppliers, and clients. He would have to discover who Victor's other accomplice was and conduct a complete cleanup of his team. It would be exhausting, painful, perhaps impossible, but he had to try. He had to fight for what he had built, for the employees who depended on those jobs, for the legacy he wanted to leave. On Sunday, the news began to spread across Greenwich. A small, affluent community doesn't keep secrets for long. The arrest of Victor Graham, a respected businessman and partner in one of the region's largest employers, was the kind of scandal that set tongues wagging. The versions of the story circulating became increasingly exaggerated, further and further from the truth. But the essence remained: betrayal, fraud, theft, and at the center of it all, a man who had fooled everyone. Elena went to Mass with her mother that morning and felt the eyes upon her. People knew she worked for Ethan. They knew she was somehow involved in the situation. Whispers followed her down the church aisles, and she kept her head down, praying for strength to face what was coming. Lords, sensing her daughter's discomfort, held her hand firmly. It didn't matter what people said. She knew her daughter. She knew her character. And she knew Elena had done the right thing, whatever the cost. On Monday, Ethan had to go to the company for the first time since the operation. Elena insisted on accompanying him, and he didn't have the strength to refuse. He needed the support, even if silent. When they arrived, they found the employees in shock. Small groups talking in whispers, pale faces, scared eyes. What would happen to them now? Would the company survive? Were their jobs safe? The questions hung in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Ethan gathered everyone in the factory cafeteria. Over 100 people squeezed into the space, waiting for answers. He climbed onto a small, improvised stage and looked at those faces. He saw fear. He saw uncertainty. He also saw fragile hope that their boss had solutions. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Hayes spoke not as a distant CEO, but as a vulnerable human being. He told the truth. He said he had been betrayed by someone he trusted completely, that the company had suffered enormous losses due to systematic fraud, that the next few months would be extremely difficult, that he couldn't promise everything would be fine, because honestly, he didn't know if he could save the company. But he promised he would fight with all his strength, that he would not abandon the people who worked for him, many for years, that he would find a way or die trying. The silence that followed his words was absolute, and then, from the back of the cafeteria, someone started clapping. It was Old Man Tony, the factory's longest-serving employee who had worked there since the first day of operation 20 years ago. Others joined in, and soon the entire cafeteria was applauding. It wasn't a triumphant ovation, it was a silent pact, a commitment to fight together, not to give up, to believe they could overcome this. Elena, watching from a corner, felt tears stream down her face. She saw something shift in Ethan at that moment. The rigidity that had always characterized him began to crack, revealing something more human, more genuine underneath. He was learning that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that asking for help wasn't shame, that trusting the right people wasn't naivete, it was courage. But the week also brought bad news. On Thursday, Mr. Miller called with information about Victor's accomplice. It was Richard Nolan, the company's chief accountant who had worked there for 8 years. He confessed everything in exchange for a plea bargain. He explained how he helped Victor mask the transfers, how he created false documentation, how he diverted the attention of external auditors. In exchange for his cooperation, he would receive a reduced sentence. But the revelation was like a second blow to Ethan's heart. Richard, the calm, efficient man who always had the right answers, who worked late to close the balances, who seemed so dedicated. He was also a traitor. He was also stealing. Ethan sat in his chair and put his head in his hands. He asked Elena how his judgment of character could be so flawed, how he hadn't realized he was surrounded by people willing to destroy him. What was wrong with him that attracted this kind of betrayal? Elena knelt beside his chair and held his face, forcing him to look into her eyes. She said there was nothing wrong with him, that sometimes bad people were very good at pretending to be good, that the fault wasn't his for trusting, it was theirs for betraying that trust, that he couldn't let bitterness take over, couldn't allow the betrayal of a few to stop him from seeing the goodness of others, like Old Man Tony's loyalty, like Jessica's courage, like her own honesty. The words penetrated the fog of despair surrounding Ethan. He looked at Elena, truly looked, and saw someone who had become indispensable in his life in a matter of weeks, not just as a helper in the crisis, but as a friend, as an anchor, as the voice of reason when everything seemed lost. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, genuine gratitude, not for services rendered, but for her presence, her unconditional support, her shared humanity. That night, Ethan made a decision. He called Elena to the study and made a proposal. He wanted her to leave the cook position and take over as the financial administrators for the company. He had seen how she worked with numbers, how she understood accounting, how her sharp mind caught details others missed. He needed someone he could trust in that crucial position, and there was no one in the world he trusted more than her. Eleanor was shocked. She said she didn't have formal training, that she had never managed a company, that she wasn't qualified. But Ethan insisted. He said she had something more important than diplomas. She had integrity. She had natural intelligence. She had his respect, and she would discover the respect of many others, and he would help her, train her, ensure she had all the necessary support. But he needed her. The company needed her. Elena thought about her mother, about the medical treatments she could now afford more easily. She thought about Jessica, who would need a new job once everything was legally resolved. She thought about herself, about the opportunity to finally use the skills she had learned from her father, but had never been able to apply professionally. And she thought about Ethan, the broken man who was slowly rebuilding himself and needed the right people by his side. She said yes. The news spread through the company with surprising speed. The cook who had discovered the fraud was being promoted to one of the most important positions in the company. Reactions were mixed. Some were genuinely happy, seeing it as a story of justice and merit. Others were resentful, feeling she didn't deserve it, wasn't qualified, and that it was merely favoritism. Elena heard the comments, felt the stabs of envy and prejudice, but kept her head held high. On her first day in her new role, Elena arrived at the company wearing simple but professional clothes that Teresa had helped her choose. Her desk was the one that had belonged to Richard, and there was something deeply symbolic about that. She was literally taking the place of a traitor, filling a void left by dishonesty with her own integrity. The first few days were terrible. She barely understood half of the systems, the processes, the bureaucracy involved in the role. But she worked tirelessly, arriving before everyone, leaving after everyone, taking work home. Ethan was beside her every step of the way, patient when she made mistakes, encouraging when she doubted herself. And slowly, very slowly, Elena began to find her rhythm. She discovered that her intuition with numbers was even better than she had imagined, that her attention to detail, honed over years of cooking where every measurement had to be precise, translated perfectly into financial work, and that her brutal honesty, which some saw as a flaw, was exactly what the company needed right now. But not everything was a victory. At the end of the second week in her new role, Elena discovered something that stopped her cold. There was a small but worrying irregularity in the records. Someone was trying to conceal a recent transfer. She investigated further, her heart accelerating with each discovery, and then she found the name responsible. It was Claudia Mason, an administrative assistant who had worked there for 3 years, one of the people who had been most friendly to Elena since her promotion. Elena brought the discovery to Ethan with trembling hands. She didn't want to believe there was more betrayal, more theft, more lies. But the numbers didn't lie. Ethan went pale when he saw the evidence. He said Claudia had been recommended by Victor when she was hired. It was obvious now that she had been part of the scheme from the beginning. One more piece in the corruption puzzle Victor had carefully constructed. The confrontation with Claudia was painful. The woman cried, begged for mercy, said she needed the money to take care of her sick mother. But Elena, heartbroken, knew they couldn't allow exceptions. Not after everything that had happened. Ethan agreed, and Claudia was dismissed immediately, with the information forwarded to the authorities. That night, Elena returned home emotionally exhausted. Lourdes noticed the weight her daughter carried and prepared tea, sitting with her at the kitchen table, as they did when Elena was a child. Elena confided about how difficult it was to make decisions that affected people's lives, about how much it hurt to discover betrayal after betrayal, about how she questioned if she was up to the challenge she had accepted. Lourdes listened in silence, and then spoke with the wisdom of someone who had lived long and learned difficult lessons. She said that doing the right thing didn't always make a person feel good, that sometimes the correct choices were the most painful ones, but that a person's character was revealed precisely in those moments, when it would be easier to look the other way, pretend not to see, let it slide. And Elena was proving to have the same strong character her father had. She was making him proud, wherever he was. Elena's tears that night were cathartic. They were tears of exhaustion, of pain, but also of renewed determination. She wouldn't give up. No matter how difficult it was, no matter how many times she had to make impossible choices, she would continue to do the right thing, because that was who she was, because her father had raised her that way, because Ethan, Jessica, and so many others depended on her to be strong. And as she slept that night, exhausted but at peace with herself, Elena didn't know that the biggest challenges were yet to come. 2 months had passed since Victor's arrest, and the company struggled to survive. The bank accounts were unlocked after the investigation confirmed exactly which amounts were legitimate and which were the result of fraud, but the damage was already done. Suppliers had cut credit, important clients moved to competitors, and the company's reputation was stained by the association with the scandal. Ethan worked tirelessly to rebuild burned bridges, to regain trust, but it was like trying to hold water with his hands. With every small victory, a new crisis arose. Elena embraced her role with a dedication that impressed even the most skeptical. She arrived at the office at 6 in the morning and often only left after 9 at night. She completely reorganized the financial department, implemented new controls, created cross-verification systems to ensure nothing went unnoticed again. But the work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. She saw the numbers every day. She knew exactly how precarious the company's financial situation was. She knew that a single mistake, a single bad decision, could be the end of everything. Jessica, after giving her full testimony and being officially cleared of any conscious involvement in the crimes, was hired by Ethan as Elena's direct assistant. The young woman worked with visible guilt, as if she needed to prove every minute that she deserved to be there, that she wasn't like Victor or Richard or Claudia. Elena tried to alleviate that burden, saying no one blamed her, but she saw in her niece's eyes that the wounds were still open. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild, even with oneself. In early December, as the cold bite of winter began to settle in Greenwich, the news everyone feared arrived. 3 of the company's largest clients had cancelled their contracts, representing almost 40% of the annual revenue. The reasons given were technical, bureaucratic, but everyone knew the truth. No one wanted to be associated with a company embroiled in a fraud scandal, no matter who the real victims were. The stain was indelible. Ethan received the news in a meeting with the remaining clients. He saw the hesitation in their faces, the fear that the company wouldn't survive, that their orders wouldn't be delivered. He tried to reassure them, presented numbers, and showed recovery plans. But when he returned to the study, he closed the door and, for the first time since everything began, allowed himself to consider the real possibility of bankruptcy. Maybe there was no saving it. Maybe the damage was irreparable. Maybe it was time to accept defeat and close the company before the debts accumulated even further. Elena walked into the study and found him staring out the window, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter exhaustion. She didn't ask what had happened, for she already knew. News travelled fast. She sat in the chair opposite his desk and waited. After a long silence, Ethan finally spoke. He said he was considering shutting everything down. That maybe it was for the best. At least he would preserve some dignity. He wouldn't drag everyone down with him. The employees could look for new jobs before it was too late. Elena felt rage burn inside her. She stood up abruptly and, for the first time since they met, yelled at him. She said she couldn't believe what she was hearing, that she hadn't endured the last hellish months, hadn't risked everything, hadn't shattered her old life only to watch him quit now. That those employees downstairs weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they were people who depended on those jobs, families relying on those paychecks. Old man Tony was 62. Who would hire him anywhere else? Mrs. Jenkins was paying for her son's college. What would happen to that boy if she lost her job? The words came out like bullets, each one hitting its mark. Ethan turned to look at her, shocked by the intensity of her reaction. Eleanor continued, her voice trembling but firm. She said she understood he was tired, that she understood it seemed impossible, but impossible wasn't the same as inevitable. There were still options, still paths. She had spent the previous night reviewing the numbers, looking for solutions, and she had ideas. Maybe they weren't perfect, maybe they were risky, but they were a chance. And as long as there was a chance, they had to fight. Ethan sat down slowly, his gaze fixed on Elena. He asked what those ideas were. Elena pulled up a chair and opened a folder full of papers covered in her hurried handwriting. She explained she had researched business recovery programs, special credit lines for distressed companies, and possible strategic partnerships. She had even discreetly contacted a few smaller textile firms that might benefit from a merger or partnership. They weren't magical solutions, but they were real possibilities. More importantly, she had a radical proposal. She suggested Ethan do something he had never done before, to be completely transparent with the employees about the company's financial standing, to show them the numbers, explain the challenges, and ask for help. Maybe they could temporarily accept a pay cut in exchange for future profit sharing. Maybe they had ideas about how to cut costs or improve processes that management had never considered. People were more resilient and creative than they were given credit for, especially when fighting for something that mattered. Ethan listened to every word, and something shifted in his expression. Resignation began to give way to a spark of determination. He took the papers Elena had brought and began to examine them, asking questions, pointing out possibilities. They worked together for the rest of the day and late into the night, building a plan. It wasn't perfect, it carried enormous risks, but it was a strategy. It was hope transformed into concrete action. The next morning, Ethan gathered all the employees again. This time, he didn't walk onto the stage alone. He asked Eleanor to stand beside him. And then, with a brutal honesty that shocked everyone, he opened the company books. He showed them the debt, the losses, and exactly how close they were to the precipice. He saw faces pale, saw fear in their eyes, but he continued. Because he also showed them the possibilities. He showed them the plan he and Eleanor had developed, and then he did something no traditional boss would do. He asked for help. What happened in the following hours was extraordinary. The employees didn't panic, as Ethan had secretly feared. Instead, they mobilized. They formed spontaneous groups to discuss ideas. Production veterans suggested modifications to processes that could cut costs without sacrificing quality. Sales staff proposed aggressive strategies to win new clients. Even the cleaning crew had suggestions on how to reduce waste. It was as if a dam had been opened, releasing years of unexpressed ideas, of unused potential. Elena watched everything with tears in her eyes. She saw Ethan talking with groups of employees, genuinely listening to what they said, jotting down suggestions, treating every person as a partner instead of a subordinate. It was a beautiful transformation to witness. The cold, distant CEO was dying, giving way to a true leader who understood that strength came not from control, but from collaboration. One of the most impactful suggestions came from Old Man Tony. He proposed that the company start producing a line of more budget-friendly products, targeting the expanding popular market. The company had always focused on mid to high-quality textiles, but there was a huge market for more accessible products. It might not have the same profit margins, but the volume would compensate. And more importantly, it would diversify the risk, preventing the company from being dependent on a few large clients. Ethan considered the idea and realized its genius. Why had he never thought of that before? Probably because he was stuck in an old mindset, in a way of doing business that had worked for years but didn't adapt to the new times. He thanked Old Man Tony publicly and announced they would implement the suggestion immediately. The old employee wept, moved to finally be heard, to have his decades of knowledge valued. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Teams working on new projects, constant meetings to refine ideas, an energy the factory hadn't felt in years. But in the midst of all this positive progress, a bomb dropped. Ethan's ex-wife, Marianne, showed up unannounced in his study one Thursday afternoon. Elena was present when Marianne walked in and immediately felt the tension in the air. The woman was elegant, impeccably dressed, with a confidence that came from years spent in privileged social circles. She greeted Ethan coldly and cast an assessing glance at Elena that made her feel small and inadequate. Marianne said they needed to talk privately, but Ethan replied that Elena was his financial administrator and could hear anything she had to say. Marianne shrugged and got straight to the point. She said she had heard about the company's financial troubles, that she knew Ethan was desperate and that she had a proposal. She knew investors who would be willing to inject capital into the company in exchange for equity. It would be the salvation he needed, the guarantee that the company would survive. But there were conditions. Ethan would have to accept no longer being the sole owner. He would have to share decisions, follow the guidance of the new partners. Ethan listened in silence, and Elena saw his jaw tighten. She knew that expression now. It was contained rage. He asked, in a dangerously calm voice, why Marianne was doing this. After 7 years of divorce, distance, and mutual indifference, why did she suddenly care about the company's fate? Marianne's answer was devastating. She said she still received alimony from him based on a percentage of the company's profits. If the company went bankrupt, she would lose that income. It was purely self-interest. The brutal honesty would have been admirable in another context, but in that moment, it was simply cruel. Ethan stood up, gesturing toward the door. He said he didn't need her help or her investors, that he would rather lose everything than sell his independence to people who only cared about profit. Marianne laughed, a humorless sound. She said he had always been too stubborn for his own good, that it was this very stubbornness that led to their divorce in the first place. And then, looking at Elena with poorly disguised contempt, she said something that cut deep. She said Ethan was making the same mistakes again. Trusting the wrong people, letting emotions interfere with business decisions. Look where that led him with Victor, and now he was doing the same thing with the cook. The words were pure venom, intended to hurt, to plant seeds of doubt. Elena felt as if she had been punched in the gut. But before she could respond, Ethan stepped forward. He said, in a voice cold as ice, that Marianne was wrong, that Elena was the most honest and competent person he had ever met, that she had saved his company when she could have easily turned her back, that she was worth more than 10 greedy investors who only wanted quick profit, and that Marianne should leave immediately before he forgot his manners and forcibly escorted her out. Marianne left with one final look of contempt, and the silence that remained was deafening. Elena was trembling, partly from anger, partly from emotion over Ethan's words. He approached her and apologized. Apologies for Marianne, for her cruel words, for putting Elena in that position. Elena shook her head, saying there was nothing to apologize for. But inside, Marianne's words echoed. What if she was right? What if Ethan was trusting her out of emotion and not actual merit? As if reading her thoughts, Ethan held Elena's shoulders and forced her to look him in the eyes. He said there was no one in the world he trusted more, that she had proven her worth 1,000 times over, that without her he would have lost everything months ago, and no matter what Marianne or anyone else said, he knew the truth. He knew who Elena really was. The tears Elena had held back during the entire interaction with Marianne finally fell. Ethan embraced her, a gesture that would have been unthinkable months ago, and she allowed herself to cry on his shoulder. They cried together over the cruelty of Marianne's words, over the accumulated stress of impossible months, over the exhaustion of fighting battle after battle, but also out of gratitude for having found each other, for the strength they discovered together, for the hope that still refused to die. That night, Elena went home later than usual. She found Lourdes still awake, sewing by the light of the living room lamp. The mother looked at her daughter's swollen face and didn't ask anything, only opened her arms. Elena curled up on the sofa beside her, as she did when she was a child, and told her everything. About Marianne, about her poisonous words, about the doubts she had planted. Lourdes listened to everything and then spoke with that simple wisdom that only comes from years of living. She said that people like Marianne would never understand people like Elena. Because they lived in different worlds. Marianne saw everything through the lens of personal gain, strategy and advantage. Elena saw through the lens of honesty, hard work, and doing the right thing. Neither was necessarily wrong. They were just fundamentally different. And Ethan was learning through pain that Eleanor's way was what he truly needed. The words brought comfort, but Eleanor knew the challenges were far from over. The next morning, she arrived at the office determined to prove, not to Marianne but to herself, that she deserved to be there. She worked with renewed intensity, double-checking every number, every projection, every detail of the recovery plan. And it was while immersed in the financial reports that she made an unexpected discovery. There was an old company bank account opened almost 15 years ago and seemingly forgotten. It had a small balance, only a few $1,000s, but what caught her attention were the regular deposits that had been made monthly over the past 3 years. Small amounts, always from the same source, a company called Modern Textiles LLC. Elena had never heard of it, and when she searched the company records, she found no contract, no agreement, nothing to justify those deposits. She brought the discovery to Ethan, who was equally confused. They researched together and discovered that Modern Textiles LLC was actually a shell company created by Victor years ago. But why would he be depositing money into a company account instead of stealing? It didn't make sense. Unless it was an account he planned to use for something specific, or unless they weren't his deposits. The investigation led them down an unexpected path. They discovered that the deposits were coming from a personal account. Marianne's. Ethan's ex-wife had been secretly depositing money into the company for 3 years. But why? Ethan called her, demanding an explanation. Marianne's response, when it finally came, was surprising. She confessed that she had tried to warn him about Victor years ago, when she first began to suspect something was wrong. But Ethan, in the pride and bitterness of their recent divorce, wouldn't listen. So she started secretly depositing money, creating an emergency reserve he could use if everything fell apart. It was her way of helping without asking permission, of protecting the man she had loved even after the marriage ended. The words were laden with regret and old sorrow. Ethan remained silent for a long time after the call. Elena saw emotions flicker across his face. Anger at Marianne's arrogance for doing something like that without consent. But also gratitude, because that money, small as it was, could make a difference, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flash of understanding that people were complex, capable of both cruelty and kindness at the same time. He decided not to use the money. He said it didn't feel right, even though it was technically his, but the discovery changed something in him. It made him realize he had judged Marianne as harshly as she had judged him. That in the end, they were both flawed humans trying to navigate a complicated world with the imperfect tools they had. It didn't mean they would start talking again. It didn't mean complete forgiveness. But it meant peace with the past. December ended with the company still standing, still fighting, but with faint signs of improvement. The new product lines were starting to generate interest. Some smaller clients had signed contracts. The debts were still enormous, but at least they weren't growing anymore. It was progress, slow and painful, but progress nonetheless. On New Year's Eve, Ethan organized a small celebration at the factory for all the employees. There was no money for big parties, but there was food, music, and above all, there was hope. At midnight, as fireworks began to burst over Greenwich, Ethan raised a toast. Not to profits or success, but to survival, to resilience, to the people who fought by his side when it would have been easier to abandon ship. Elena was beside him, and when their eyes met, there was a mutual understanding that needed no words. They had weathered storm after storm, and they weren't yet in calm waters. But they were together, and that somehow made all the difference. 6 months had passed since that New Year's Eve, and the town woke up under a clear June sky. Elena arrived at the company as she did every day, but this time there was something different in the air. Today was the day of Victor Graham's final sentencing. After months of delays, appeals, and legal maneuvers, justice would finally deliver its verdict. Ethan had been tense since waking up, and Elena could see the anxiety in his every movement. The company had changed drastically in those months. The new line of budget-friendly products proposed by Old Man Tony was exceeding all expectations, now accounting for almost 30% of revenue. New clients had been secured, drawn by the reputation for honesty Ethan had built by being transparent about the problems and the recovery. And more importantly, the culture within the company was completely different. Employees were no longer just workers. They were partners invested in collective success. But there were still scars. The debts accumulated during the months of crisis still weighed heavily. Some of the best employees had left during the difficult times, seeking stability elsewhere. And Ethan carried visible guilt for everything that had happened, for not seeing the betrayal sooner, for putting so many people at risk due to his misplaced trust. Eleanor tried to alleviate that burden, but knew that some wounds only time could heal. Jessica was flourishing in her role as a financial assistant. The young woman who months ago cried in fear now worked with growing confidence, her organizational skills and attention to detail proving invaluable. She and Elena formed a formidable duo, complementing each other's skills. And more importantly, the niece had regained confidence in herself, understanding that being fooled didn't make her weak or stupid, just human. Ethan's phone rang shortly after 10 in the morning. It was Mr. Miller calling from the courthouse. His voice was thick with emotion as he delivered the news. Victor Graham had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. Richard Nolan, due to his cooperation, received a lesser sentence of 4 years, and Claudia Mason, for her minor role in the scheme, was sentenced to 2 years of house arrest. Justice, slow as ever, had finally prevailed. Ethan hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long moment. Elena, who was present, waited. She had learned to give him space to process emotions without rush. Finally, he spoke. He said he didn't feel the satisfaction he expected. There was no joy in seeing a man he considered a friend be taken to prison. There was only a deep sadness for everything that had been lost, for a friendship that never truly existed, for years of trust that were merely an elaborate lie. Eleanor approached and sat beside him. She said it was normal to feel that way, that closure didn't always bring the peace one expected, but that this was necessary, not just for justice itself, but for what it symbolized, that there were consequences for betrayal, that honesty mattered, that doing the right thing had value even when it was difficult. The words were simple, but they carried a weight of truth that Ethan needed to hear. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at Ethan's office. Not an email, but a physical letter, handwritten on official prison stationery. It was from Victor. Ethan held the envelope for several minutes without opening it, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Elena asked if he wanted privacy, but Ethan shook his head. He said he needed her there. He needed someone to anchor him, to stop him from falling into the trap of sentimentality or anger that the letter might bring. He opened the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. The letter was surprisingly brief. Victor wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, that he knew he didn't deserve it. But he wanted Ethan to know the complete truth, that everything started 15 years ago, when he himself had been betrayed by an investor who led him to personal bankruptcy. That anger and resentment consumed him, transforming him into something he himself didn't recognize. That seeing Ethan overcome his own betrayal and build success, he felt an envy so profound it turned into hatred. Victor wrote that he started stealing small amounts just to balance what he saw as injustice, but once he started, he couldn't stop. Greed grew, fueled by the ease with which he could deceive, by the arrogance of believing he would never be caught. And now, sitting in a cell, he finally saw clearly the monster he had become. The letter ended with a single sentence: "You deserved a better friend. I regret never being that man." Ethan read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing a different layer of emotion: anger at the betrayal, sadness for the lost friendship, and strangely, a flicker of compassion for the broken man Victor had become. He folded the letter carefully and put it away in a drawer. He told Elena he didn't know what to do with it, how to process it. She replied that maybe he didn't need to do anything yet, that some things simply needed time to be absorbed, understood, perhaps eventually forgiven. But not now. Now was just about acknowledging and moving forward. In the following weeks, the company continued its gradual recovery, but Elena noticed something different about Ethan. He was quieter, more introspective. He spent time looking out the study window, lost in thoughts he didn't share. She knew him well enough now to know that something was brewing inside him, some decision being formed, and she was afraid of what it might be. The truth came on a rainy afternoon in July. Ethan called her into the study and asked her to sit down. He said he had thought deeply about everything that had happened, about the lessons learned, about the kind of man he wanted to be from now on. And he had come to a conclusion. He wanted to make Elena a partner in the company. Not just an employee, not just an administrator, but a true partner with equity and decision-making power equal to his own. Elena was speechless. She said he didn't have to do that she was already more than grateful for the opportunity he had given her. But Ethan insisted. He said it wasn't about gratitude, it was about justice. She had saved the company as surely as if she had invested capital in it. Her work, her dedication, her honesty were contributions as valuable as money. And more importantly, he no longer wanted to be alone at the top. He wanted a true partner, someone he trusted completely to share both the successes and the difficulties. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face without her trying to stop them. She thought of her father, of how proud he would be to see her at that moment. She thought of all the years working in humble jobs, being invisible, never recognized for her true worth. And she thought about how life could change in ways impossible to predict, how doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, eventually brought unimaginable rewards. The news of the new partnership spread quickly through the company and across Greenwich. Reactions were varied. Many were genuinely happy, seeing it as an inspiring story of merit rewarded. Others were skeptical, questioning if a former cook truly had the qualifications to be a partner in a textile company. And some were resentful, seeing favoritism where there was only recognition of value. Elena heard the comments, felt the stabs of envy and prejudice. But this time, she didn't let them affect her. She was certain of who she was, what she had achieved, and the value she brought. She didn't need the approval of strangers. She had Ethan's trust, her family's pride, and above all, the certainty of her own clean conscience. But fate had one last twist in store. In August, 3 months after the sentencing, a legal notification arrived. Victor was attempting to overturn the sentence, claiming he had been coerced into confessing that the evidence had been obtained illegally. His lawyers had found a technical loophole in the process and were exploiting it to the fullest. If they succeeded, the trial would be nullified, and the entire process would have to start from scratch. The news was devastating. Ethan was furious, feeling as if the justice that had finally arrived was being snatched away from him. Elena was equally shocked, but tried to remain calm. Mr. Miller reassured them that such appeals rarely succeeded, that the evidence against Victor was too solid. But rarely wasn't never, and the possibility, however small, was terrifying. The following months were filled with renewed anxiety. Victor's appeal went to a higher court, and the process dragged on with the glacial speed typical of the judicial system. Every day without news was torture. Every rumor that a decision was imminent frayed their nerves. And in the midst of it all, the company had to keep operating, keep growing, keep moving forward, even when it seemed the past refused to stay behind. It was during this period that Elena showed her true strength. While Ethan struggled with anger and frustration, she kept the company running. She made tough decisions, negotiated important contracts, kept employees focused and motivated. She proved to anyone who still doubted that she deserved to be a partner not by favor, but by pure capability. Lords, whose health had significantly improved with the adequate medical treatment they could now afford, watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and worry. She saw how Elena worked tirelessly, how she carried the weight of the company on her shoulders, how she sacrificed her own well-being for the good of others. And she reminded her daughter, gently but firmly, that heroes also needed rest, that saving the world was pointless if she destroyed herself in the process. It was in one of these conversations that Lourdes said something that would stay with Eleanor forever. She said her father always believed that true success was measured not by money or position, but by how many lives you touched positively. And that Elena, by saving that company, had saved not only Ethan, but hundreds of families who depended on those jobs. That this was the kind of legacy that mattered, the kind that survived beyond any title or fortune. Finally, in late November, a year after Elena first found the documents, Mr. Miller called with the final news. The appellate court had rejected Victor's motion. The conviction stood. Ethan received the news with surprising calm. There was no explosion of joy or dramatic relief, just a deep exhale, as if he had been holding his breath for months and could finally breathe again. He looked at Elena and said simply, "It's over." And she responded, "Yes, it's over." But something far more important was just beginning. With legal certainty finally established, banks and investors who had kept their distance began to approach. The story of the company that survived massive fraud and rebuilt itself with honesty and transparency was inspiring. It was the kind of story people wanted to support. Offers of favorable credit began to arrive. Partnership proposals from other firms, even some of the clients who had left, returned, impressed by the resilience shown. In December, exactly 1 year after that first modest New Year's celebration, the company organized a very different party. This time, there was money to do something special. Ethan rented a ballroom downtown and invited not only all the employees but their families too. He wanted to celebrate not just the company's survival, but all the people who made it possible. During the party, Ethan gave a speech that left few eyes dry. He spoke about how a year ago he was ready to give up, to accept defeat. He spoke about how he was saved not by investors or elaborate strategies, but by the honesty of a cook who risked everything to do the right thing. He spoke about how every person in that room had contributed to the miracle of recovery, with their ideas, their hard work, their loyalty when it would have been easier to abandon ship. And then, to Elena's surprise, he called her to the stage. In front of everyone, Ethan publicly formalized the partnership, presenting Elena not as his employee, not as someone he hired, but as his equal partner. He said that anyone who worked at that company from then on would answer to both him and her. That decisions would be made jointly, that she had as much right and responsibility over the company as he did. The applause that followed was deafening. Eleanor, always uncomfortable with public attention, felt compelled to say a few words. She thanked Ethan for his trust. She thanked the employees for their support, but most of all, she thanked her father, wherever he was, for teaching her that character mattered more than convenience, that doing the right thing was worth any cost. Jessica was openly crying, proud of her aunt in a way that went beyond words. Teresa, who had been so skeptical in the beginning, hugged her sister tightly, whispering apologies for having doubted her. Lourdes, seated in a chair of honor that Ethan had insisted on providing, smiled with tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. Her husband would be so proud. Her daughter had become everything he always knew she could be. When the party ended and everyone left, Ethan and Elena remained in the empty ballroom, helping to tidy up the last things. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who know each other deeply. Finally, Ethan stopped and looked at her. He said there was something he needed to ask, something he had been thinking about for months, but never had the courage to verbalize. He asked if she regretted it. Did she regret bringing those documents to him on that rainy October night that now seemed a lifetime ago? Did she regret choosing honesty, even knowing it would risk everything? Because he knew that choice had cost her dearly. It had cost her sleep, cost her peace with her family for a time, cost her the comfortable security of a simple, predictable life. Eleanor thought for a long moment before answering, and then she said something that was pure truth. She said she regretted nothing, that if she had to do it all over again, she would make exactly the same choices, because in the end, she could look in the mirror and like the person she saw. She could sleep at night with a clear conscience. She could look at her mother, at her niece, at all those employees' families, and know she made a difference in their lives. And that feeling, she said, was worth more than any comfort silence could have brought. Ethan nodded, and she saw something in his eyes that wasn't there before. It was peace, true peace, not just with the situation, but with himself. He too had learned his lessons. He learned that trusting the right people wasn't weakness, but wisdom. That vulnerability was strength, that success measured only in profits was empty, but success measured in lives positively impacted was lasting. They walked out of the ballroom together, strolling through the streets of Greenwich that sparkled with Christmas decorations. The affluent town slept peacefully, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded there, the battles fought and won, the lives transformed, and perhaps it was better that way. Because in the end, it wasn't about public recognition or grand celebration. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. It was about getting up when life knocked you down. It was about trusting again, even after being betrayed. Elena looked up at the starry sky and sent a silent prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for the difficult path that had brought her there. Gratitude for the people placed in her path. Gratitude for the strength she discovered within herself that she didn't even know existed. And gratitude for the second chance life had given her, the chance to prove that a humble cook could save an empire, not with weapons or tricks, but simply by doing what was right. And Ethan, walking beside her, felt an equally deep gratitude. Gratitude for the woman who saved him when he was about to lose everything. Gratitude for the painful but necessary lesson about trusting the right people. Gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild not only his company but himself, becoming the kind of leader, the kind of man he always should have been. The story that began with tears in a rainy kitchen ended with hope under a starry sky. It wasn't a perfect ending, because real life rarely offers perfect endings. There were still challenges ahead, still scars to heal, still a long road to travel. But it was an honest ending, a deserved ending, an ending that proved that doing the right thing, even when it cost everything, eventually paid off. And as they walked together through the empty streets of Greenwich, two survivors of a storm that almost destroyed them, Elena and Ethan knew a fundamental truth. They had found something rare and precious in each other. Not romance, but something perhaps deeper, true partnership, absolute trust. Mutual respect forged in the fire of adversity, and the certainty that no matter what storms came in the future, they would face them together. Because in the end, that's what saved them. Not brilliant strategies or strokes of luck. It was the simple decision of two people to do the right thing, to support each other and never give up. And that, they discovered, was the most powerful form of heroism. The quiet kind, forged in the everyday. In the small choices that accumulate into massive transformations, the cook had saved the businessman, and in the process, they both saved each other. They gave themselves and hundreds of other people a second chance. They proved that honesty was not just a beautiful ideal, but a practical, life-changing force. And they built, brick by brick, choice by choice, something that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. A legacy not of wealth, but of character. Not of power, but of integrity. Not of easy victory, but of resilience tested and proven. And that ultimately was the only kind of legacy that truly mattered.